Lieutenant Robert Fitzgerald sat at his navigation table in the nose of a B-29 superfortress, watching his carefully plotted course dissolve into meaninglessness. It was the night of February 25th, 1945, and his bomber was somewhere over the Pacific Ocean, part of a stream of aircraft heading toward Tokyo. The problem was that somewhere had become increasingly uncertain over the past hour. Outside the plexiglass nose, there was nothing but darkness. Below, the ocean was invisible, a WWII. A solid overcast had shut out the stars. Fitzgerald's sextant, the primary tool of celestial navigation, was useless without stars to shoot. His dead reckoning plot, based on compass heading, airspeed, and time, had accumulated errors over the 1,500-mile flight from Guam. Wind estimates were guesses. Drift calculations were approximations. Every mile flown added uncertainty to his position. The B-29 carried 11 men, 30,000 pounds of incendiary bombs, and enough fuel for a round trip that would take 14 hours. If Fitzgerald's navigation was wrong, if he couldn't find Tokyo, the mission failed. If he led them too far off course, they might not have fuel to return. The Pacific Ocean below them was vast, empty, and utterly unforgiving. This was the central problem facing every navigator in the 20th Air Force during the strategic bombing campaign against Japan. How do you find a target 1,500 miles away over featureless ocean when you cannot see the stars, when weather obscures landmarks, when radio navigation aids are unreliable or absent, and when the slightest error in calculation compounds into miles of displacement? The answer that emerged was not what anyone expected. It came not from advanced technology or official doctrine, but from navigators who, facing impossible conditions, developed methods their instructors back in the United States would have dismissed as crude, imprecise, or just plain stupid. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The story of how American bomber crews found Tokyo in total darkness is not about sophisticated equipment or brilliant planning. It is about the gap between training and reality, about methods that worked versus methods that should have worked, and about men who trusted their improvised solutions over official procedures because their lives depended on it. This story begins not over the Pacific, but in navigation classrooms in the United States, where young officers learned the precise mathematical science of aerial navigation. They studied celestial navigation, using sextants to measure star angles and plotting positions with geometric accuracy. They learned dead reckoning, calculating position based on speed, time, and heading. They practiced radio navigation using directional signals from ground stations. These methods worked well in training flights over the continental United States, where landmarks were visible, weather was often clear, and radio stations were numerous. The training created confidence. Navigators graduated believing they had mastered the tools needed to find any target anywhere in the world. Then they arrived in the Pacific Theater and discovered that everything they had learned was inadequate for the mission they were asked to perform. The flight to Tokyo from bases in the Mariana Islands was unlike anything they had trained for. The distance was extreme, the weather was consistently poor, the target was a city in a hostile nation that provided no navigation aids and took active measures to confuse incoming bombers. Finding Tokyo required navigators to abandon much of what they had been taught and develop new methods born from desperation and practical experience. What emerged was a navigation technique that looked nothing like what their instructors had taught, but it worked. And in war, results matter more than theory. The Boeing B-29 Superfortress represented the most advanced bomber aircraft in the world when it entered service in 1944. It could fly higher, faster, and farther than any previous bomber. Its pressurized crew compartments allowed operations at 30,000 feet. Its 4 Wright R-3350 engines, each producing 2,200 horsepower, gave it a top speed of 357 miles per hour. Its range exceeded 3,000 miles with a bomb load. These capabilities made the B-29 the only American aircraft capable of reaching Japan from bases the United States could realistically establish and defend. The Mariana Islands, captured in summer 1944, provided the necessary airfields. Saipan, Tinian, and Guam were transformed into massive air bases with runways extending across former sugarcane fields and jungle. By late 1944, construction crews had built facilities to support hundreds of B-29s. The distance from these bases to Tokyo was approximately 1,500 miles. This created a navigation challenge unlike anything American air crews had previously faced in the war. Over Europe, bombers flew relatively short distances over land where landmarks, radio navigation aids, and escort fighters were available. The 8th Air Force bombing Germany operated in a fundamentally different environment than the 20th Air Force bombing Japan. Navigators in B-29s faced an ocean crossing longer than the distance from London to Berlin, with no landmarks, no radio beacons over most of the route, and weather conditions that frequently obscured both stars and sea. The Pacific Ocean between the Marianas and Japan offered nothing to navigate by except water, clouds, and occasionally visible stars. The official navigation doctrine taught at navigation schools emphasized celestial navigation as the primary method for overwater flight. The technique was theoretically sound. A navigator would use a sextant to measure the angle between a known star and the horizon. By taking multiple star sites and performing calculations, he could determine the aircraft's position with reasonable accuracy. This method required several conditions. The navigator needed a visible horizon, preferably a sharp line between sea and sky. He needed visible stars, preferably multiple stars at different angles. He needed stable air, as turbulence made accurate sextant readings nearly impossible. He needed time to perform calculations using almanacs, tables, and plotting charts to convert star angles into position lines on a map. In the Pacific theater, these conditions rarely existed together. Cloud cover was frequent, obscuring stars. At night over the ocean, the horizon was often invisible or indistinct. Turbulence from weather fronts and the jet stream made steady sextant readings difficult. Combat conditions, with the aircraft maneuvering to avoid searchlights and anti-aircraft fire over the target, made celestial navigation impossible when it was most needed. Dead reckoning, the backup method, relied on knowing the aircraft's speed, heading, and the wind conditions. The navigator would plot a course on his chart, marking the planned track from departure point to target. Every few minutes he would advance the position along the track based on elapsed time and estimated ground speed. The method accumulated errors. Airspeed indicators measured speed through the air, not speed over the ground. Wind pushed the aircraft off course. Compass headings were affected by magnetic variation and deviation. Small errors in any of these factors compounded over 1,500 miles into position uncertainties of 50 miles or more. Radio navigation offered some help, but it was limited. The Marianas had radio direction finding stations that could provide bearings for the first few hundred miles of flight. Japan occasionally transmitted radio signals that could be used for homing, but Japanese operators learned to recognize when bombers were using their signals and would shut down transmitters or broadcast false signals. The reality was that navigators approaching Tokyo in darkness often had only approximate knowledge of their position, yet they were expected to guide their bombers to specific aiming points in a blacked-out city defended by hundreds of anti-aircraft guns and night fighters. The training navigators received in the United States prepared them for navigation as a precise mathematical discipline. At navigation schools at bases like Selman Field in Louisiana or Hondo Field in Texas, students spent months learning celestial navigation theory. They memorized star positions. They practiced sextant techniques. They worked through dozens of sight reduction problems. converting measured angles into position lines through careful calculation. The emphasis was on accuracy and proper procedure. Instructors stressed the importance of following established methods. Navigation was presented as a science with correct and incorrect ways of doing things. Students who developed shortcuts or unconventional techniques were corrected. The goal was to produce navigators who could reliably determine position using standard methods under standard conditions. This training created certain assumptions. Navigators learned to trust their instruments and their calculations. They learned that celestial navigation, properly performed, gave accurate results. They learned that dead reckoning, carefully maintained, provided reliable backup. They learned that navigation was fundamentally about measurement and mathematics. These assumptions worked well in training. Practice flights over the United States allowed navigators to verify their work. If a calculated position was wrong, landmarks quickly revealed the error. Instructors could evaluate student performance by comparing navigated positions with known locations. The system produced competent navigators by peacetime standards. But the Pacific War was not peacetime, and the flight to Tokyo bore little resemblance to training missions over Texas. The first shock came with the weather. Navigators arriving in the Marianas discovered that clear skies were rare. The tropical climate produced massive cloud formations that built from morning through afternoon. The jet stream at bombing altitudes created persistent cloud cover. Weather fronts moved through regularly, bringing overcast conditions that could last for days. On a typical mission to Tokyo, a navigator might get clear star sights during the first hour after takeoff from Guam. Then clouds would close in, making celestial navigation impossible for the next several hours. As the formation approached Japan, clouds might clear again, or they might not. The unpredictability meant navigators could not count on their primary navigation method being available when they needed it most. The second shock was the distance. 1,500 miles over water was simply farther than most navigators had ever flown. Small errors that were insignificant on a 300-mile training flight became critical over 5 times that distance. A 1-degree error in heading, maintained for 5 hours, would put the bomber 30 miles off course. Wind estimates wrong by 10 miles per hour would create 50-mile position errors. The third shock was the combat environment. Over the target, Japanese searchlights probed the sky. Anti-aircraft fire burst at bomber altitude, forcing evasive maneuvers. Night fighters prowled the darkness, hunting for bombers silhouetted against searchlight beams. In these conditions, navigators had no opportunity to carefully shoot star sights or work through complex calculations. They had to navigate while their aircraft jinked and turned, while shells burst nearby, while the crew called out threats and the pilot maneuvered violently. The fourth shock was the consequences of failure. Over Europe, a bomber that missed its target could often find alternate targets or at least drop its bombs in the general target area before returning to England. The distances were short enough that fuel margins provided options. In the Pacific, there were no alternate targets worth the fuel cost to reach. If a navigator failed to find Tokyo, the bomber would drop its bombs in the ocean and hope there was enough fuel to reach Guam. Running out of fuel over the Pacific meant ditching in the open ocean with slim chances of rescue. These realities forced navigators to adapt. The methods that had worked in training were inadequate. Something had to change, and what changed was everything. The navigators who flew the early missions to Tokyo in late 1944 quickly discovered that textbook navigation was impossible. The first B-29 strike against Tokyo from the Marianas occurred on November 24, 1944. 111 superfortresses took off from Saipan and Guam. Only 24 reached the primary target and bombed with any accuracy. Weather, navigation errors, and mechanical problems scattered the formation. The mission report documented the navigation problems in clinical detail. Navigators reported that cloud cover obscured stars for most of the outbound flight. Dead reckoning positions at the initial point, where bombers should begin their bomb run, showed dispersions of up to 50 miles. Some aircraft arrived over Tokyo 20 minutes early. Others arrived 40 minutes late. The bomber stream that should have concentrated over the target in a tight window instead arrived scattered across an hour. Japanese defenders had ample time to react to each small group of bombers as they arrived. Searchlights pinpointed aircraft. Anti-aircraft fire concentrated on illuminated targets. Night fighters found isolated bombers. The mission achieved minimal damage to Tokyo's aircraft industry while exposing the fundamental problem with the campaign. The problem was not courage or determination. B-29 crews were willing to fly the missions. The problem was not equipment failure. The superfortresses, despite early mechanical troubles, could reach Tokyo and return. The problem was finding the target in conditions that made conventional navigation unreliable. Brigadier General Haywood Hansell, commanding the 21st Bomber Command, emphasized precision bombing from high altitude in daylight. This doctrine, proven over Germany, assumed that bombers could reach their targets and that bombardiers could aim accurately with Norden bomb sights. But over Japan, weather conditions rarely allowed visual bombing. The jet stream at 30,000 feet created winds exceeding 200 miles per hour that blew formations off course. Cloud cover obscured targets. In January 1945, Major General Curtis LeMay replaced Hansell and began changing tactics. LeMay had commanded B-29 operations from China and understood the limitations. He recognized that precision bombing was achieving negligible results. Japanese war production continued. The strategic air campaign was failing. LeMay's solution was radical. He ordered bombers to attack at night from low altitude, 7,000 to 9,000 feet, carrying incendiary bombs instead of high explosives. The tactics maximized bomb load by removing most defensive armament, reducing crew size, and flying low where fuel consumption was lower. The incendiaries would create massive fires in Japanese cities built largely of wood and paper. This change created new navigation problems. High-altitude bombing had allowed navigators to see farther, to spot landmarks earlier, to correct course over longer distances. Low-altitude night bombing meant navigators had minimal visibility until they were nearly over the target. They had to arrive at precise locations at precise times with less information than ever before. The solution emerged from practical experience rather than official doctrine. Lead aircraft equipped with the best navigators and early radar systems would find the target first. They would mark it with incendiaries, creating a visual reference point visible for miles. Following aircraft would navigate to that fire marker rather than to map coordinates. But even the lead navigators needed methods that worked in darkness and clouds. What developed was a simplified approach to celestial navigation that would have horrified training instructors but proved effective in combat. Instead of calculating precise positions using multiple star sights and complex mathematics, navigators used quick, approximate methods with a few key stars. The breakthrough was recognizing that perfection was unnecessary. A navigator did not need to know his position within 1 mile. He needed to know it within 10 miles. That was close enough to find Tokyo, close enough to adjust course as the formation approached the Japanese coast, close enough to see the fires that marked the target. The practical method developed by experienced navigators was deceptively simple. Before each mission, navigators would prepare what they called a pre-computed star chart. This was not the elaborate celestial navigation plotting they had learned in training. It was a single sheet of paper with predicted positions of 3 or 4 bright stars at hourly intervals along the route to Tokyo. The navigator would note which stars would be visible at specific times, assuming clear sky. He would mark their expected altitude angles and azimuths. During the flight, when stars became visible through breaks in clouds, he would quickly shoot one star with his sextant, compare the measured angle to his pre-computed prediction, and estimate his position error without working through the full sight reduction calculation. This method violated every principle of precise navigation taught in training schools. It relied on approximations rather than exact calculations. It used single star sights instead of multiple position lines. It produced position estimates rather than position fixes. Any instructor evaluating this technique would have marked it as inadequate, but it worked because it was fast enough to use in combat conditions and accurate enough for the mission requirements. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The navigators also developed timing techniques that did not appear in any manual. They discovered that maintaining a precise timeline was more important than maintaining a precise position. If all bombers in a formation maintained the same schedule, they would arrive over Tokyo at the planned time, even if their navigated positions contained errors. The lead navigator would establish the schedule: departure from Guam at a specific time, first checkpoint at a specific time, coast in at Japan at a specific time, initial point at a specific time. The following aircraft would maintain this schedule, adjusting speed as necessary. If weather or navigation uncertainty made it impossible to maintain course, crews would at least maintain schedule. This approach meant that even if individual bombers were uncertain of their exact position over the featureless Pacific, the entire formation would converge on Tokyo at the planned time. The fires set by lead aircraft would provide visual reference for following bombers, even if navigation had accumulated significant errors. Another practical innovation was the use of dead reckoning with deliberate bias. Navigators learned that it was better to aim slightly north or south of Tokyo, then turn toward the city when reaching the coast, rather than to aim directly at Tokyo and risk missing the entire landmass. By planning a course that would intersect the Japanese coast at a specific, recognizable geographical feature, navigators gave themselves a reference point. If the course intersected the coast at the Bozo Peninsula south of Tokyo, the navigator knew to turn north. If it intersected at the Izu Peninsula southwest of Tokyo, he knew to turn northeast. Even in darkness, radar could detect coastlines. Land masses showed clearly on the early radar sets, even when individual buildings did not. These methods shared a common characteristic. They reduced navigation to its essential purpose, getting the bomber close enough to the target that crew members could identify it visually or on radar. They abandoned the pursuit of precision for the achievement of adequate accuracy under impossible conditions. The older navigators, the ones who had completed dozens of missions, developed instinctive judgment about when to trust their calculations and when to trust their experience. They learned to recognize weather patterns that indicated they were on course or off course. They learned to estimate wind drift by observing wave patterns on the ocean surface when visibility allowed. They learned which Japanese radio signals were reliable homing beacons and which were deception transmissions. This accumulated practical knowledge could not be taught in navigation school. It could only be learned through repeated experience over the same route under varying conditions. The night of March 9th to 10th, 1945, demonstrated how completely navigation methods had changed from doctrine to practice. 334 B-29s launched from Guam, Tinian, and Saipan for the largest firebombing raid yet attempted against Tokyo. The mission was planned as a concentrated night attack. All aircraft would arrive over the target within a 2-hour window, overwhelming Japanese defenses with sheer numbers while creating a firestorm that would consume entire districts. Navigation for this mission was critical. If the bomber stream arrived scattered, Japanese defenses would destroy bombers piecemeal. If significant numbers of aircraft missed Tokyo entirely, the concentration of incendiaries necessary to create a firestorm would not be achieved. The mission's success depended on navigators using their practical, improvised methods under the worst possible conditions. Weather forecasts predicted heavy clouds over the Pacific with possible breaks near Japan. The formation would fly at altitudes between 5,000 and 9,000 feet, low enough that fuel consumption was reduced, but high enough to avoid most light anti-aircraft fire. Bombers would carry maximum incendiary loads, roughly 6 tons per aircraft, by removing most ammunition for defensive guns. The lead Pathfinder aircraft took off first, their navigators knowing that everything depended on them finding Tokyo and marking it for the following bombers. These navigators carried their pre-computed star charts, their simplified navigation plots, their notes on timing and checkpoints accumulated over previous missions. Lieutenant Robert Fitzgerald, the navigator whose uncertainty had opened this story, was in one of the lead aircraft. His mission was to reach Tokyo, identify the aiming point in the Shitamachi district, and drop incendiaries to mark it for following aircraft. He had flown 8 previous missions to Japan. He knew the route. He knew the methods that worked. During the first 2 hours of flight, clouds obscured the stars completely. Fitzgerald navigated by dead reckoning, maintaining his planned schedule, trusting that wind estimates based on previous missions would be close enough. At the 3-hour mark, clouds broke temporarily. He grabbed his sextant, found Polaris through the astrodome, shot a quick angle, and compared it to his pre-computed chart. His position was 12 miles north of planned track. Not perfect, but well within acceptable limits. He passed a heading correction to the pilot. The bomber turned slightly south. Fitzgerald marked the time and position on his chart, knowing he would dead reckon from this fix for the next hour. As the formation approached Japan, radar operators began seeing returns from the coastline. The landmass appeared on their screens as a bright line against the darkness of the ocean. Fitzgerald cross-checked the radar picture against his navigation plot. The coast appeared where he expected it, confirmation that his navigation had been adequate despite clouds, despite limited star sights, despite all the factors that made textbook navigation impossible. The bomber reached the initial point on schedule. Below, Tokyo spread across the landscape, a city of 6 million people, mostly dark under blackout conditions, but with enough ambient light to reveal major features. Fitzgerald identified the Sumida River, the reference point for the aiming area. The bombardier took control for the bomb run. At 0 hour, 15 minutes after midnight, the lead aircraft released their incendiaries over the designated marking points. The bombs fell, ignited, and began burning. Within minutes, dozens of fires dotted the target area, visible for 50 miles. Following aircraft, arriving on schedule from their bases, saw the fires and navigated directly to them. The navigators who brought those following bombers to Tokyo used the same simplified, practical methods. They had maintained their schedules, shot quick star sights when possible, dead reckoned through clouds, and arrived close enough to see the fires that marked their target. By dawn on March 10th, the fires in Tokyo were visible from 100 miles away. Navigators on returning B-29s could see the glow on the horizon long before reaching their bases. The smoke column rose to 15,000 feet, creating its own weather system with thunderstorms forming in the superheated air. Reconnaissance photographs taken later that morning showed 16 square miles of Tokyo reduced to ash. The official casualty estimates eventually settled on approximately 100,000 dead, though the true number would never be known with certainty. The firestorm had created temperatures exceeding 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit in some areas. People caught in the fire zone were incinerated, leaving no remains to count. Others suffocated as the firestorm consumed oxygen. Still others drowned in canals and rivers where they had sought refuge from the flames. It was the deadliest single air raid of the war, surpassing even the later atomic bombings in immediate casualties. And it succeeded because navigators had found Tokyo in total darkness using methods their instructors would have called inadequate. The navigation techniques developed through desperate trial and error had proven themselves under the most demanding conditions imaginable. The simplified star charts, the timing emphasis, the use of deliberate course bias, all the practical innovations that experienced navigators had cobbled together, had brought 334 bombers to the same target within a 2-hour window despite weather, despite darkness, despite every factor that made textbook navigation impossible. After March 10th, these methods became standard procedure for the 21st Bomber Command. Training materials were updated, not to teach the complex celestial navigation emphasized in navigation schools, but to teach the simplified methods that actually worked over the Pacific. New navigators arriving in the Marianas were briefed by veterans who explained what to forget from training and what to learn for survival. The firebombing campaign continued with increasing intensity through spring and summer of 1945. Nagoya was burned on March 11th, Osaka on March 13th, Kobe on March 16th. Every mission followed the same pattern. Lead navigators using practical methods found the target. They marked it with incendiaries. Following bombers navigated to the fires and added their bomb loads. By late July, 64 Japanese cities had been attacked with incendiaries. The major urban areas were devastated. Japanese war production, already strained by naval blockade and raw material shortages, collapsed as factory districts burned. The civilian population was demoralized, industrial workers killed or displaced, transportation networks disrupted. The strategic bombing campaign achieved its objectives. It destroyed Japan's ability to wage war. It demonstrated that the home islands were vulnerable. It contributed, along with the Soviet invasion of Manchuria and the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, to Japan's decision to surrender in August 1945. But for the navigators who had developed the methods that made this campaign possible, victory came with uncomfortable knowledge. Their improvised solutions, born from desperation and refined through experience, had enabled destruction on a scale unprecedented in human history. They had been correct to abandon textbook navigation for practical methods. They had been right to trust their simplified star charts and timing techniques over complex calculations. Being right meant they had successfully guided bombers to targets where tens of thousands of civilians died in firestorms. Lieutenant Fitzgerald returned to the United States in October 1945, after completing his combat tour. He had flown 35 missions to Japan, navigating his B-29 crew through 1,500 miles of darkness and clouds, finding Tokyo and other cities with adequate accuracy, using methods that worked rather than methods that were supposed to work. His navigation logs and charts, preserved in his personal papers, show the evolution from complex calculations in early missions to simplified techniques in later ones. The post-war analysis of the strategic bombing campaign against Japan examined every aspect of the air offensive. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey, a massive effort involving hundreds of analysts and researchers, interviewed Japanese officials, examined records, inspected damage, and evaluated effectiveness. The navigation section of the report documented what had been learned. The survey confirmed that conventional celestial navigation, as taught in training programs, was inadequate for Pacific operations. The distances were too great. The weather was too poor. The combat conditions were too demanding. What worked was simplified navigation focused on adequate accuracy rather than precision, combined with tactics that concentrated bombers on visual markers rather than dispersing them to individual aim points. These findings influenced post-war navigation training. The elaborate celestial navigation curriculum was simplified. Greater emphasis was placed on practical problem-solving and adaptation to actual conditions. Navigators were taught to recognize when conditions made standard methods impractical and to develop alternative approaches. But the survey also documented the human cost of navigational success. The firebombing campaign had killed between 300,000 and 500,000 Japanese civilians. It had destroyed millions of homes. It had displaced populations from urban areas to countryside, where food and shelter were scarce. The strategic bombing had worked, in the sense that it had achieved its military objectives, but the methods employed and the results produced raised questions about proportionality, necessity, and the nature of total war. Navigators who participated in the campaign had varied responses to their role. Some viewed it as necessary war work, pointing out that Japan had started the war with its attack on Pearl Harbor, had committed atrocities throughout Asia, and had refused to surrender until subjected to overwhelming force. The firebombing had shortened the war, they argued, saving lives that would have been lost in an invasion of the Japanese home islands. Others struggled with what they had participated in. They had done their jobs competently, navigating bombers to targets in the most difficult conditions imaginable. But their competence had enabled the killing of civilians on a massive scale. The fact that Japanese cities were legitimate military targets under the strategic bombing doctrine of the time did not eliminate the moral weight of what had happened. The question of whether the strategic bombing campaign against Japanese cities was justified, necessary, or proportionate has been debated by historians for decades. Arguments can be made from multiple perspectives. What is not debatable is that the campaign succeeded because navigators developed practical methods that worked under impossible conditions. The irony is profound. Navigation schools in the United States had trained thousands of officers in the sophisticated science of aerial navigation. They had taught precise methods, mathematical calculations, and proper procedures. They had emphasized accuracy and by-the-book technique. Their graduates had arrived in the Pacific Theater confident in their training. Then they discovered that their training was inadequate. The conditions they faced over the Pacific bore no resemblance to training flights over Texas. The methods that worked in theory failed in practice. What worked instead were crude approximations, simplified charts, and practical shortcuts developed by necessity rather than taught by doctrine. The navigators who succeeded were the ones who recognized this reality and adapted quickly. They abandoned the pursuit of precision for the achievement of adequate accuracy. They trusted experience over theory. They developed methods that would have earned failing grades in navigation school but brought bombers to Tokyo in total darkness. They were right to do so. Their improvised methods worked. But being right about navigation methods meant being complicit in a campaign that killed hundreds of thousands of civilians. The cost of that truth was something each navigator had to reconcile individually. The story of how navigators found Tokyo using methods their instructors dismissed reveals something fundamental about the gap between training and reality in war. Military training necessarily occurs under controlled conditions with known variables. The goal is to teach standard procedures that work under standard conditions. But war rarely provides standard conditions. The Pacific War confronted American air crews with unprecedented challenges. The distances were extreme. The weather was terrible. The enemy was determined and capable. The missions required sustained operations under conditions that pushed equipment and men to their limits. In this environment, standard procedures often failed. What emerged was not chaos or improvisation for its own sake, but rather a process of practical adaptation. Experienced navigators identified which elements of their training remained useful and which needed to be abandoned. They retained the fundamental principles of navigation while discarding the elaborate procedures that consumed too much time or required conditions that never existed. The simplified star charts that navigators developed were not anti-intellectual or anti-science. They were practical applications of celestial navigation principles adapted to combat conditions. A navigator who shot one star sight and estimated his position from a pre-computed chart was still doing celestial navigation. He was just doing it fast enough and simply enough to be useful in combat. This pattern of theory yielding to practice under the pressure of actual operations appeared throughout the war in all theaters. Tank crews learned that official tactics for armor employment often failed in specific terrain and developed local variations. Infantry units discovered that training in how to assault fortified positions rarely matched the reality of combat and adapted techniques. Bomber formations found that official defensive formations left gaps and modified them based on experience with enemy fighters. In every case, the military organizations that succeeded were the ones that allowed practical adaptation while maintaining essential standards. The 21st Bomber Command did not abandon navigation. It adapted navigation methods to actual conditions. The distinction matters because it explains why American forces, despite facing unprecedented challenges, generally succeeded in achieving their objectives. Lieutenant Fitzgerald, sitting at his navigation table over the dark Pacific on the night of February 25, 1945, faced a choice that thousands of navigators faced on thousands of missions. He could follow the procedures he had been taught, attempting precise celestial navigation under impossible conditions and likely failing to find Tokyo. Or he could use the simplified practical methods developed by experience, methods that looked crude compared to textbook navigation, but actually worked. He chose the practical methods. So did the other lead navigators on that mission and on every subsequent mission. They brought the bombers to Tokyo, they enabled the firebombing campaign, they contributed to ending the war, and they carried the knowledge of what their navigational competence had enabled. The cost of truth in this story exists on multiple levels. There was the truth that official navigation doctrine was inadequate for Pacific operations. There was the truth that simplified methods dismissed as crude actually worked better than sophisticated methods that required impossible conditions. There was the truth that strategic bombing of cities killed enormous numbers of civilians regardless of military justification. And there was the personal truth that each navigator had to confront about his role in these events. The navigators who brought bombers to Tokyo in total darkness using star charts their instructors would have called stupid were neither heroes nor villains. They were competent professionals doing difficult work under terrible conditions. They identified problems, developed solutions, and executed missions that achieved strategic objectives. That their success enabled destruction on a massive scale is part of the larger truth about industrial warfare between modern nations, where technical competence in service of strategic goals produces consequences that transcend any individual's intentions or understanding. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.